hats or even in earbuds, actually, that have electrodes, and they're reading brain signals or any biosignal, actually. And then effectively, it's a bit cargo culty, but throwing it through a large language model, and something fun comes out the other end.
Okay, so today I am happy to catch up with an old friend and business partner, Lawrence Lundy. Brian, welcome, Lawrence.
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
Those of you that have been following Outlier for a while will hopefully remember Lawrence from back in the day when we were a team of 3 or 4. I think, Lawrence, you joined Aaron and I as like employee number... Yeah, either 3 or 4, I think. Predating even the accelerator, when we were a little bit more like an incubator, I guess. And Lawrence joined as head of research. He's now partner for research at Outlier Ventures, and actually just dropped his latest thought piece, which looked brilliant and interesting. And knowing the work that we'd done with Lawrence in the past on things like the convergence thesis, convergence stack, convergence ecosystem, blockchain AI, blockchain-enabled convergence with AI.
It's back. Blockchain and AI is back.
We were right. I think we were right. Yeah. Really kind of significantly contributed and led to a lot of thesis work at Outlier Ventures that still holds. That's still kind of on North Star, and yes, is kind of manifesting in the world, albeit a little bit later, perhaps than we'd hoped at Outlier anyway. But he's continuing that good work at Outlier Ventures. Outlier Ventures is doing early stage investment into deep tech. So for him, I guess continuation of what was back then. I mean, blockchain was definitely considered deep tech. It was kind of at its R&D phase, right? It wasn't yet beginning to be commercialized. You could argue only just being commercialized now. And he's been doing lots of interesting things at Luna, as well as advising the UK government and various other organizations, World Economic Forum, OECD, etc., on deep tech, future of tech. I was probably due a kind of coffee, lunch, beer with him, and I thought, well, it would just be a waste for us to kind of not share that with the kind of wider community. So let's get into maybe. So I've done kind of intro to you, relationship to Outlier, but maybe just like give us 5 minutes on your career trajectory leading you to your role at Luna and what you're doing at Luna now.
It's a very clear thread, but only retrospectively. I think the reality of what I've done, I studied politics, and then I worked in sort of strategy consulting, and then as a market analyst, all the way through to the latest bit of work called State of the Future, and all of the organizations you mentioned. It's all about trying to put together a few different themes, whether it's a technology or a market or a geography, and find interesting intersections. The convergence thesis is the canonical example of that. But I mean, it happened. I think I'm very interested as a generalist, right? Because I studied politics, so I'm not, we have lots of PhDs in the team, and in deep tech, it's full of, extremely detailed people that have the domain expertise. I don't have that, but what I do have is sort of a general curiosity around a lot of things, and often I find interesting things at the intersections. When I joined you guys, 2014, I think. I'd previously been doing work with Intel over in Portland, and we were looking at the role, if I recall the title, the role of Bitcoin and or distributed ledger technology for Intel. We did a whole project for a year or so, and gave them a report, which turned into Sawtooth Lake, which was then gifted to Hyperledger, as I recall. So very interested in Bitcoin and crypto back in 2014, and then sort of spent the time with you trying to focus on crypto to go very, very deep. But then, you can only keep a generalist down for so long. And then I had to find broader. Now I'm extremely broad, which is deep tech, which is a bit too broad, even for me. So I'm sort of specializing a little bit in privacy enhancing technologies, which we can get into, silicon and semiconductors, I'm particularly interested in, and a few other themes that we can get into.
So I think you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice because you have and can go pretty deep into particular domains. So I remember specifically in AI, you certainly helped me us as an organization go, far deeper than we could have done in isolation, whilst not necessarily being, somebody, as you say, with a PhD in that discipline. But I think also working in deep tech kind of requires you to be able to navigate a lot of unknowns, right? The whole point of it being deep tech is that there are a lot of unknowns. Certainly pathways to commercialization are unknowns. There might be multiple pathways, even within a particular domain, where people are proposing, a particular implementation or approach is going to be the dominant one. Weighing those up or interrogating and weighing them up and then timing them, I guess, is kind of the base skill set, right?
The methodology that I use to say the future, which is really simple, it's supposed to be simple. I'll go into it. It's 5 stages. So like, how technically mature is the technology? And I only use like a basic score, 1 to 5, right? Anybody could do it with some basic understanding. Like, how technically ready is it? Maps to the technical readiness level score, 1 to 9. And then it's, what are the drivers? Which is where I sort of maybe have some insight. These can be macro drivers. So for a lot of the technologies like small modular reactors or deep geothermal, it's climate change, right? It's a clear driver. And one of the things that we do, which I think is interesting, is the restraints, which is often maybe, because this is how you get to timing, like what are the restraints? Are they regulation? Psychedelics? Is the thing banned? So you can think through how hard will this be deployed? Then novelty, how different is it to what already exists? So this is particularly interested with say blockchains generally. They score really high on novelty because of the thing that they do. There's no other technology that exists that does the same thing. And then it gets misapplied to other things where there's maybe better things. But generally, I like to find those technologies where there is no other thing that could be used as an alternative. So that's sort of novelty. And then the 2 areas that we land on, which is how you go from a long list of 100 technologies to, say, 20 or 10 interesting ones, is how impactful can it be based on those things, right? Based on, a 5+ would be whole brain emulation. Large language models, and a 1 or a low would be, I don't know, RISC-V, which is just like open source instruction set architecture. And you score from 1 to 5, and then you look, okay, based on the restraints and the drivers, what's the right timing? So when should we be investing in this? When will the market be large enough for an investment? And that's sort of the process or that methodology that I've gone through, systematically to try and go from the universe of deep tech that you can invest into, well, no, let's invest in deep geothermal energy, which we're not going to invest in. That's a bad example, but I don't know. NFTs could be an interesting example of something that actually you probably would invest in because of that skill set, of that methodology, sorry.
There's lots of research institutes that kind of do this work on deep tech, right? They could be publicly funded, they could be private. But I find that if you're working in venture, you kind of have an advantage on all the other things that you mentioned because of the last point that you mentioned, which is if you're having to deploy capital, you're speaking to lots of different startups, you're seeing all the different approaches that they're taking, you're just getting a much more practical insight into what people are actually doing, what they're communicating, are their limitations. Okay, it's slightly earlier stage, but I think, versus just theoretically being sat in a research institute trying to time this stuff, but removed from actually the innovation part, it just makes everything else much harder, right?
That's exactly right on 2 fronts. One, because sitting in a venture firm, you have more information. That's right. You have your existing portfolio, which may be pushing the state of the art in fully homomorphic encryption, for example. So you can map what we know is really going on versus what people are saying publicly. But then the second thing is, having recently decided, for bad or for good or ill, to publish weekly, like to have this Substack, which I do weekly, which is if you start having to put yourself out there and actually show your working, show your analysis, you're holding yourself to account. But then even more, you have to put money towards your viewpoints. So it's not a consulting firm that says the market's going to grow by 10% and who cares, right? Or this is the next big thing, or who cares? If we say, and the research suggests this is the next big thing, we're going to put money to it. So we have to be damn sure. So I feel like there's a information asymmetry, but also just skin in the game, which means that compared to the sorts of things I was saying 10 years ago, the level of conviction you need is so much greater.
And is that weekly thing based on the velocity of innovation that you're seeing? Like there's almost a requirement to be publishing with that cadence, or is it just a personal thing?
It's related to the fact to hold myself account. The State of the Future process came about as an internal project to say, can we find repeatable investment thesis? Right? Is that something we can do? So you come up with the methodology. And I wrote maybe, I think in the end it was about 94. I always say 100 plus, but I think it was 94 or something. When no one's going to see it, the quality was worse. And I know that now. So the quality was worse, and I would say things I would throw out and then I'd move on. And when you know you have to publish it, and in the best case, some world-leading experts are going to read what you say and tell you, you wrote something wrong on the internet, then you have to do better quality research and you have to force yourself. And so I've decided that, by publishing, I can get that feedback faster. So the way I see it is that there's a bit of a local model. It's not true because all the Lunar team have contributed. And so we have, lots of contributions, but generally it's a local model, right? A Lunar local model. And the more that I can open that up and get contributors and feedback, the better, the more accurate the model will be. So that's the way I see it.
Yeah. And I think that's really kind of the DNA of Outlier. Thinking aloud is critical, right? To kind of get that feedback. So obviously that's something I personally subscribe to. I try to get the org to, but it's hard. A lot of people don't, especially the more technical people, actually don't like thinking out loud and publishing. They want to be as technically correct as possible, which can be quite limiting to that feedback loop. Maybe let's segue into the state of future, the recent one. I want to get into some of its themes, but maybe just as a segue to kind of link, say, at the top end, we were talking about some of the AI stuff happening, coming true, or decentralized instances of it. A quick reflection on the convergence thesis and where you think that stands today.
Crypto's weird because you sort of didn't need to get the timing quite right. My gut tells me that it still stands to be correct, and it will be even more correct as time goes on. It was obviously ahead of its time, and for a normal investment thesis outside of crypto, it would have been dead because we'd have mistimed the market. I think what I've come to realize is you can only really be contrarian 18 months ahead of everyone else, right? Because you need someone to follow on. In crypto, it was different. So, and it'd be interesting what you think, because you know the market better than I do now. There was a moment in time where these big, wildly ambitious projects, not just layer ones, but I'm thinking Aragon at the time, Ocean Protocol. There are a whole bunch of these projects that were trying to do something that never would have been funded under the normal venture capital system, quite rightly, because there was no market at that time. If you're going to hold it to very strong account, it was wrong because the timing was wrong, but directionally it was correct, and we were in the right market to make the bet. In fact, I sort of dabble in crypto, but I'm strongly of the view you have to be in it every day to be a good investor in it, and I'm not anymore. But one of the areas is sort of decentralized AI, which is still at that interface, which I still am always pulled back into because I think that the value proposition is so powerful. And if anything, what we've seen with large language models and what we've seen with the value of data go up and these large language models scraping the internet for all the data they can find is that the idea that there become these data monopolies, if you didn't believe it 5 years ago or 4 years ago, well, you can sure see it now. So the actual value proposition has got stronger. I spoke with somebody, a founder building in the space. I'm very intrigued to know, is that the theme? Is it the next hype, but is that the actual thing that starts bringing people from outside of crypto into crypto? Because that is the thing, the hook. I don't know, interesting to see how you feel, having been there the whole time as it's developed.
Well, so it's interesting. I had, not by design actually, but the last guest, or I think the last podcast published was with Trent McConaughey of Ocean Protocol, reflecting on his thinking, Ocean Protocol, but also more generally, his thinking around decentralized AI, given, certainly from my perspective, he was one of the first people I come across talking about this in a sophisticated way. So it was interesting, to have him on and then you kind of following off the back of that. The problem with crypto is it cycles. It has this extreme attention surplus or attention deficit that really kind of interrupts the innovation cycle, right? It has this kind of weird market cycle that disrupts, perverts, it distorts the innovation cycle. I remember when we kind of did the Fetch investment, we did the Ocean investment, only to speak to some of the big funds now that are still around that are all about making AI and blockchain investments. And, they back then they just say that's sci-fi, and in a way they were right. And from their investment kind of perspective, they have these time-based GPLP funds. They have to return funds within that time frame in a way that we don't. At Outlier, we can make our investments. Obviously, we hope to time them correctly, but we don't have to. We don't have to be right this cycle. We could be right, the next cycle. But I do think that I still believe all roads lead to Web3, and I think AI is going to be a driver of that, because if you kind of look at the explosion in, as you say, large language models, already you're seeing the limitations of how it's been trained on open web data. It's kind of plateauing a little bit. All of a sudden, you do need to incentivize this new data economy. And obviously, there's several years now building out that infrastructure. Will it be used? Could it compete with perhaps a more traditional centralized approach? Will it live in parallel? We'll see. I actually think now is probably the moment for a lot of our convergence thesis thinking to actually see how it plays out. I think it took a lot longer than we'd thought, maybe even hoped, but I do think directionally it's true. And I think we made as good a bets as we could have done to have a stake in that race. So, kind of just watching and seeing how it plays out.
It was actually included, and subsequently I've come to believe it's like a critical enabler of those. I sort of still think of it as a stack, correctly or incorrectly, but crypto and then AI on top. There's this interface which sort of been interesting. Privacy, and I think it's broadly called privacy enhancing technologies now. And actually, it was one of the first areas of research when I joined Luna, which was to say they'd already made an investment into Zama, was doing fully homomorphic encryption. In fact, applying it to blockchains now, interestingly enough. This idea of there's a missing bit of infrastructure, and it is this privacy technology, whether it's fully homomorphic encryption or multi-party computation. Zero-knowledge proofs are already seen. As an example, they are a privacy-enhancing tech, right? Zero-knowledge is actually one of the first pets to be applied to crypto. And I would imagine we are seeing with MPC, because Coinbase acquired, I think it was Unbound, or most of wallets now use some form of multi-party computation for key management. So I think there's like this privacy layer that once it's built out is an enabler for data to be stored more appropriately on the broader Web3 ecosystem. It was in there, and I went back and reread it before this podcast, and it was noticed. But in retrospect, I think focusing more on that, I don't know if there would have been better investments at the time, but I do think that's an area that we're going to see even more in.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, obviously, we did make the secret network, what became the secret network investment.
Right, Enigma, exactly.
Yeah, previously Enigma. Recently, I think we're now Missing Link, especially in a commercial sense, where multiple parties are comfortable, prepared to begin to aggregate data, to, develop collective learning models or whatever it may be. We kind of just need a little bit more robust privacy tech. At the same time, actually doing the ZK stuff now, you realize it's still very early, right? There's still a lot of stuff, very kind of hard technical problems that need to be built out, a lot of middleware that needs to be built out.
Even silicon, even all the way down to ASICs, right? ZK ASICs, exactly.
So on the one hand, it feels closer. On the other hand, you kind of go, oh, well, actually, shit, there's several more problems that now, it's kind of like that. You open up the box, you think you got the present, and inside's like another problem that you got to solve. But anyway, let's get into state of the future, because there's a lot in there. We don't have a huge amount of time, and I want to do it justice. So could you? I don't know if it's important to give context to previous state of the futures, like themes that you built on, versus just going straight into what it is today. I don't know what you find.
The trajectory of it was this basic methodology to try and find repeatable investment theses. And the way I conducted it, or this idea is you would have a bunch of cards, 3x3 grid or 4x4, whatever. You would have, each technology with a basic assessment. You'd look at zero knowledge proofs, multi-party computation, and small modular reactors, nuclear fusion, and you would have them all. You would try and find interesting intersections to invest in. That's the concept behind it. So this sort of structure of a technology, really, it was there from the beginning, and now, that was phase one. Well, actually, phase one was I was going to interview 3 people per card, right? I would find 3 people to interview on GameFi or DeSci, and then I would write the card. And it turns out that was an impossible task. partly because everybody disagreed with each other and I couldn't find a consistent idea. I went away for effectively 2 years and just wrote as much as I could that was wrong on the internet. And that was phase 1. And then it's launched, it's open source. Phase 2 is get external contributors, people telling me it's wrong, improving it, doing interviews to improve it, which I'm going through the process now. And then phase 3, which I hope we get to, is it becomes an open source commons. It becomes, you want to invest in deep tech, or you're a curious person, you're interested. You can go and Wikipedia style, you just contribute to it. And it's sort of an upvote, downvote. I think I joke on the about page, in theory, it could be a DAO. It probably won't be a DAO because I don't want to take legal liability for what someone's going to say exactly. But that's the concept of it. So it's this 3-stage thing. Ultimately, it should be the commons. And yeah, the work now is to just consistently do interviews, improve the overall process, and just try to get all of these technologies to a more robust assessment.
All right. Well, then let's jump into it. Where are we at? What is the state of the future?
First thing to say is I could have put numbers to all of them. There is a cargo cult math approach here where I could have said this scores 96 and this scores 52. In fact, I may even do a top of the pop style, like top 100, which might even be quite good. I don't know. But the best I could come up with was underrated, overrated, or correctly rated. I think it's an interesting, traffic light approach to saying, I think I wrote in the first couple of Substack posts, the 3 most overrated technologies and the 3 most underrated technologies. I'll pick on a few that sort of elucidate the work that I'm trying to do, which is there are some technologies which we know about, and then you look at, say, the supply side, what innovations are happening underneath the surface that are making things, in hardware, miniaturizing, or the cost is getting cheaper, or I don't know, a variety of things that will happen on the technical side. And there's also demand side changes. There's regulation, changing behavioral trends, there's generational shifts. So you can sort of look at things that are changing in the market that might change a technology from being a small market to a large, fast growth rate. In fact, over time, I've come to realize I'm actually just looking for technologies that are currently growing 5% that are then going to grow 20%. What forced that change? What is the catalyst? And so the ones that are most interesting are those where there's a catalyst, which the market isn't aware of, or I don't think the market's aware of.
It's not priced in somehow.
I don't think so, exactly. And for weird reasons as well. So just to give one example, surprisingly underrated would be brain recording, because I don't really want to get into brain computing interfaces yet, even though the last thing I did on State of the Future, last interview, was with a brain computing interface company called Wise Ear. I find it interesting because on the one hand, it seems very sci-fi, but on the other hand, we can see consistent drip by drip, month on month developments in sort of whether it's imaging equipment, EEG machines, or various other machines that are able to get signals from non-invasive procedures, right? Because we can have invasive procedures like Neuralink, right? Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is an invasive surgical procedure. But I'm not interested in that so much as, hats or even in earbuds, actually, that have electrodes and they're reading brain waves or brain signals, or any biosignal, actually. And then effectively, it's a bit cargo culty, but throwing it through a large language model and something fun comes out the other end. I think that is a data problem. It's actually not necessarily a hardware problem, not really a science problem. It's literally just we need to collect as much data as possible. And once we throw it into these trained models, we will find out things that we don't know. I believe that we are much closer to having those data sets. Meta do a lot of work on this, interestingly. But there are other AI labs that are doing the same exactly. And Apple do some work with the Vision Pro, which is sort of proto brain computing interfaces. But the point of it is, it's so groundbreaking if it were to be true, brain recording technology. It's so, the amount of value that it would create as upside and downside would be tremendous. And yet, to me, it feels very, very close. So that's an example of something changed in the market, large language models. The secondary consequences of that are we need lots of, trained models and that can throw in images, words. Well, the conceit is, what if we just fed in brain images? And what if we fed in brain signals? What comes out the other end? To me, that feels quite close.
Forgive my ignorance, but is that the same or actually completely opposite to this thing that was in the news recently where they stimulated a Pink Floyd song in somebody's mind's eye, I guess, mind's ear,
right,
artificially. Is the other way around, isn't it? But is there any kind of
it's bi-directional, exactly. So it's, read and write is the best way to think about it. So we have read technology, which is what I'm talking about, and then the read and write becomes a brain computing interface. So write is to be able to stimulate specific neurons to have specific effects. Now, we sort of already do that, weirdly, with deep brain stimulation. We already deep brain stimulation, DBS, is a known modality, a known technology. It's also in State of the Future as an assessment. And it's used, FDA approved for, I think, depression and a variety of other neurodegenerative diseases or disorders. We already sort of stimulate, that's sort of right. And all the effort over the next 15, 20 years will be, eventually we'll get to a point where we can read and write to the brain. But my contention is the read piece, just understanding what's going on, is close. The write piece, to me, feels much longer, much further away.
I'm assuming if you can read the brain, you get the data, you can train the models, and then presumably that could then write. I don't know.
Well, that's the right avenue, or at least that's the thesis. That would be the right avenue, yeah. And whether or not you start as a healthcare, this is a good debate, because you start as a healthcare company to collect the data, which is sort of what a lot of companies say. Start as a healthcare company, collect the data. Others say too slow, everyone needs surgery, you need clinical trials. Let's create devices where we can collect relatively weak signals, but you can get a lot of it. So it's sort of this volume, quantity versus quality debate in the industry.
All right, cool. So in spirit of topping the pops, we count down, I don't know, was that like number 5? I don't know how much time we've got. What would number 4 be?
I think a particularly interesting one, silicon, because we can talk about silicon as it relates to crypto and also as it relates to AI and pretty much everything else. Silicon is not one assessment. Within it, I've wrote about chiplets, I've wrote about a particular type of memory called high bandwidth memory, a whole bunch of things, optical computing, analog computing, quantum computing. So it's all there. But collectively, I'm of the view that it all boils down eventually to hardware. Like, we did the software, we continue to do software over the X number of years, and certainly the last 15 years, most of the innovation, most of the capital went into software. And AI is already reaching this point where we're not, Moore's law will continue. It's not dead. I don't believe that for a minute. The innovation in the supply chain is vast. We're continuing to miniaturize. And I think electronic computing has still a long way to go. If we think about all of especially AI and large language models, just because of the 50% growth rate year on year, I think, that's on probably the lower end of the estimates, the overall market. The market has exploded, and there are bottlenecks all over the supply chain. I'm surprised that didn't happen in Web3 earlier. I was always thinking eventually it will come down to hardware, the chips. I remember the trusted execution environments were used a little bit, now probably TGX. And, there was the GPUs, and there was obviously the Bitcoin mining was part of that hardware piece. But at zero knowledge, I would argue really needs dedicated hardware. I think we're starting to get that. FHE needs dedicated hardware, and we're seeing it. I suppose my overall point around the importance of it is there's only so much you can do in software, and eventually the bottleneck for compute and the bottleneck for memory and all of these bottlenecks become in silicon, which is why I'm spending a lot of my time trying to understand that supply chain, because it's, I think it'll be $1 trillion. The overall semiconductor industry will be worth $1 trillion by 2030 or something. NVIDIA is already worth $1 trillion. Like, there's the numbers for this stuff is vast. And if I were going to bet the farm on the next 10 years, I would bet the farm on silicon or just hardware rather than anything on software.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously, as you know, NVIDIA are kind of good friends of ours, and we've one way or the other always kept in contact with Intel, since your days, and both of them have almost all but dropped kind of crypto from one of their growth drivers. And of course, now it's the growth story is just attached to AI. But it is interesting, you then talk about things like zero knowledge. I've not really heard any mention of that as a driver in the context of, chip, silicon and stuff like that from the big
it'll be a relatively small niche application to start. Then we see a couple of startups trying to focus on it. The problem with anything in silicon, this is the problem with investing in it, is scale. You just need to get capacity. You need to persuade fabs to tape out your chips. And it's much easier to sell to Apple with a guaranteed market or NVIDIA than it is to a startup. So there's challenges around investing in it, which is why I think spending a lot of time in trying to understand it is important. I would imagine if it was crypto from 2015 to 2020 is the place to be, and maybe AI certainly now, 2022 to 2025 or something. I don't know. It's not that simple. But the most important thing, China are already ahead of the game on this for sure. Just the amount of effort and innovation and time that can go into semiconductors, I would bet on that being the back end of this decade, the most important area.
Yeah, I mean, you can see a lot of the geopolitics playing out around that, right? As people try to hedge, diversify against things happening in Taiwan, and Samsung CEO released from jail to come back and take over the helm in South Korea at the request of Biden, and various other things, right? It's becoming the most important geopolitical debate. All right, so that's 4, 5, 3.
It's not quite that simple, but the one thing I would...
I'm grossly simplifying it, but in respect of your time, we could start at 99, but I don't know if you've got that much time. I can hear the kids.
No, and it's not. I don't have it all in my head either. But one thing I wanted to touch on: each of them are attached to a prediction, which eventually I'd like to put in the prediction market. But one of the predictions is that the largest trained model is a DAO by 2030. So I think this is really interesting because I think that federated learning is the technology I'll touch on here. I came across it. It's not really a privacy enhancing technology at all. It's a sort of a machine learning technique in particular. But federated learning is a way to train you have a local model train on a device, on an edge device, and it's an algorithm by which you can train your model locally, and then you send not any data, but just the weights, and send that back to a global model, right? So you can imagine Google tried it with federated learning on cookies, or Flock. I don't know. I think federated learning on cookies. And it was mentioned a few times where you could keep your data at the edge, never send your data to servers. I think that's really interesting and important. And I could imagine a community, a DAO, an alternative to Hugging Face, which gives people the opportunity to, share all of their browser data on their phone or GPS data, use that to train a global model. It needs a little bit of privacy on top, maybe some differential privacy, or that it doesn't have privacy guarantees, federated learning, but you get the benefit of, as an individual, being able to train this global model. If you can it's the same decentralization thesis. If you can get 1 million people to let you use their devices because maybe you're paying them for it, or there's some benefit as being part of a collective DAO, then you are going to outcompete any company that can just do it themselves. Maybe. I don't know. OpenAI will probably be $1 trillion company in a couple of years, so maybe not. But that's the thesis behind federated learning being a really critical enabler of this, AI at the edge.
Oh, well, that's quite a nice old school one for us anyway, and one we've kind of been talking about for a while. And what's your view on, so I'm kind of still, before we get into maybe like the final two to highlight, agent-based systems. So like the more I look at something like OpenAI is, as I understand it, still highly centralized approach. I just can't see, even with another several billion in investment and everything else, how a for-profit platform AI could get anywhere near to generalized intelligence. It just requires so many specialist data points that I still bias towards this agent-based approach, which is you might have AI interface, which feels generalized because you're asking, hey, Siri, question A, and it can give you a specialist answer on everything. But behind that interface is a market, effectively a marketplace of specialist agents owned and trained by, billions of different participants.
Please try again.
Siri just tried to answer that. Classic.
I think directionally that would be how I would think about the future. The difference is those agents at the moment, there's no need for them to be decentralized. I would love for them to be both private and decentralized, but for the moment, like LangChain is already like a pretty decent infrastructure for building this. Baby AGI is another. There's Auto AGI, I think is the term. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of this. There's a new class of these agents that are running around the internet and doing. We've seen a couple of companies trying to do this for various use cases. But I think that is probably a good mental model for thinking about. Yeah, there's the single interface, but then behind it there are a bunch of agents that do various different things that are specifically trained. And then the question is, well, okay, it doesn't really matter what the interface is. You'd have all of those agents running around. What does the ownership model look like, right? Because that's ultimately what we're saying. And I like to think, what are the privacy guarantees there as well? So yeah, it's like a single point, but then like a whole bunch of like interesting ecosystem stuff going on underneath. But I agree. You said marketplace. I think I'm more minded to think it's longer term. I think I actually say this in the privacy enhancing technology paper, that ultimately a data marketplace is going to be the best way to allocate scarce resource, right? To manage up supply and demand. Eventually, how we get to like a full data marketplace requires a few more steps. Maybe Trent believes we're further ahead than maybe I do, but maybe I spend too much time in regulated industries now and I don't actually see the future as easily. But still, I think that there's steps to get to this overall data marketplace or agent marketplace, but it feels that is the inevitable outcome because we've seen over civilization that markets are the best way to allocate scarce resources with some regulation on the side to make sure it doesn't go totally out of balance. But yeah.
So in aggregate, it feels and functions like AGI, but it's not an individual instance of it on a particular platform.
That is already what OpenAI is. It is a bunch of different trained models. So it's not just a singular one. And it's broken up and it's distributed because of different clusters. And the weeds of it, again, it probably looks like what you were describing the future looks like already. OpenAI and Anthropic and Cohere, all of these models are, smaller models that aggregate up. And I think we'll see that with newer models coming out over the next year or two will be the same. That'll be the pattern, right? Lots of locally trained models and a UX that makes it seem simpler than it is.
Awesome. So final two, and I'm putting you on the spot now to kind of pick your favorite children, but if you're going to have to die on a hill.
We didn't publish the State of the Future work before the sort of blow up in large language models. Yes, there was GPT-3, and maybe sort of around the time of GPT-3, sort of before the explosion, and maybe the December last year, maybe how I've seen it, maybe a bit before. I had written an analysis of I don't think it was specifically large language models, but I think it was large language models, not Gen AI. But anyway, large language models as a 5+ technology, 5+ in my scoring, right? As in, there are only 3 or 4 that were 5+, impact-wise. Whole brain emulation is another one, because they're transformative potentials. They really are a general purpose technology. And there aren't many of them in this whole assessment, but there are a few. One is large language models. Despite the hype, and we are in a hypey period, and despite the money going in, I think my prediction is something in the order of by 2030, the labor productivity will have increased by 10% in OECD countries. That might not seem like a lot, but if we have anywhere near 10% increase in productivity, the economic gains for that are vast. So I'm of the view that, we're getting ahead of ourselves. There'll probably be actually, a glut of products in the market over the next 24 months that fail to get PMF, and there might be media might start saying it was a hype, but slowly but surely, all of these tools, whether it's just the generation of content in music, we already see with Spotify saying they're not going to take down AI songs, whether it be movies, all the different forms of content. I think we have a general purpose technology for the creation of digital content. I don't have the capacity to think through all the implications, so I just know they're going to be vast. And actually, there's very few other technologies that I think any of us will probably ever come across that will be as profound. Even if we don't get to general intelligence, I don't think we have to surpass human baseline intelligence to get all of the gains in it being a transformative technology. And then, beyond that, beyond a general intelligence, I don't have the capacity to talk competently about, if I'm honest.
Well, a lot of people don't even necessarily fully agree on that as even a thing, right? So last but not least, what's the final one you're going to go out on?
It's a good combination of the two. And maybe it's a good parallel because timing's wrong. So on the one hand, we have large language models. And on the other hand, I've spoken about neuroscience or brain recording. I'm sure I'm biased, because I don't know if you know this, but I was going to study experimental psychology before I changed to politics totally randomly on a whim. Neuroscience has always been a keen interest. So I'm for sure biased, but I think that is the vanguard. It's already the vanguard in healthcare to try and understand, as I said, neural signals and neurons to try and attach that to solve a lot of healthcare issues. This idea of whole brain emulation has fascinated me for a very long time because it's just a compute problem. Whole brain emulation is nothing more than just throwing a tremendous amount of compute to try and model the brain on various different scales scales, right? Scales of the neuron, and then scales within the neuron, all the way through to the connections, modeling that dynamically. We don't have the compute capacity, anywhere near the compute capacity. According to the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, I think their best guess on when we would even have the right amount of compute power and memory at some reasonable cost is 2060.
Doesn't it require quantum, like quantum computing?
Yeah, I don't know is the answer. And the reality is we don't know if we'll ever be able to create a noise. Well, at the moment we're in like an intermediate stage, right? Noisy intermediate quantum stage. We don't know if we'll ever really be able to come up with a practical quantum computer. People believe, but there's still some science risk on whether or not it's impossible at all. But yeah, quantum could be a part of it because we can obviously, as high performance computing. But I think photonic computing could be a part of this in terms of parallelizing a tremendous amount of data. I think there's different approaches. But yeah, we just don't have the resources. So maybe a quantum computer comes along and we can bring that down. But the reason why I'm mentioning whole brain emulation is that 2060 might be far away for us in our careers and in venture capital. 2060 is in our children's lifetime. That's what's quite an interesting approach to state of the future is, it's not going to be around in the next 10 years. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, let's not worry about it. But then if you actually model out some of these technologies, they're within our children's lifetime. So that's unbelievable to me. And if I mention large language models having sort of 10% increase in labor productivity, could you imagine the economic potential to have unlimited labor, intellectual labor at will? We're getting sort of sci-fi futurist, and that's fine because it is state of the future. But to me, that feels like, along with AGI, which we don't know if we can create, whole brain emulation, we sort of do know what we could do. It's just engineering. It's just more compute, probably more energy, actually. You probably need fusion, maybe, to be able to provide enough limitless energy to be able to run this stuff. But yeah, whole brain emulation to me is the holy grail. And if I were like, a 20-year-old thinking about what I wanted to dedicate my life to, I would probably think modeling, start with worms, which we're getting closer to, and then rats, mice, and then eventually I hope that we're on that pathway.
You told me 20 years ago, if you were talking to me 20 years ago or 10 years ago and saying something would take 10, 20 years, that would feel like a lifetime away. But, Outlier's almost 10 years old. I've been working in the web and remember taking Facebook into advertising agencies when they had like a team of 5 people here in Europe. That was 20 years ago. 20 years isn't a very long time, really, in the scheme of things, as you say, for a lot of these things to kind of catalyze. Lawrence, it's been great catching up. I'm glad we did this publicly rather than just you and me, although it would be good to get a beer in at some point. And looks like you've been working out a bit, mate, as well. I'm looking at those arms. You've got some guns on you at the moment.
I'm not actually holding them on purpose to do that, but yeah, what can I say?
I wasn't saying you were showing off, but I noticed them anyway, so that's not sure it says more about me than you. Anyway, Lawrence, thanks for coming on. How can people find you, follow you, and also find and contribute to State of the Future? So it's
stateofthefuture.xyz as the basic website. It's got all the information on, but actually the most important way at the moment is probably the Substack, which is weekly. So it's State of the Future. And the reason why I think that's important is because every week I'm sort of saying, here's what I'm focusing on this week. Next week, I'll be focusing on this. Are you building in this space? Get in touch. Are you looking for investment? Get in touch. So it's actually sort of like exactly as you described earlier on, work, thinking in out loud, just in this newsletter. So I would recommend subscribing to that first and foremost. I'm technically on X, but as you know, I'm not a huge X user or social media user. So the Substack, I think, is best.
It's getting worse by the minute as well.